good to go? Okay. Thank you all for being here. Very good to see everybody. Errol Louis, an adjunct professor here at the CUNY Graduate School of Journalism, and I am glad to welcome you to a session that we talked about for quite a while over at the Center for Community and Ethnic Media, and I'm glad we're getting a chance to do it before the primary on Tuesday. We want to talk for a little over an hour and invite you to join in the conversation as we go through it about what the stakes are in the current election, and in turn, what it means not just for what's likely to happen on Tuesday and what's likely to happen in November, who's likely to be serving in various positions from the mayor to the city council to the Brooklyn district attorney and judicial races if you guys want to go there. But more to the point, what's going to happen in the city? What's the fate of the issues that really matter? And at a minimum, what we're hoping is that those of you who are trying to work out your own coverage, not just for primary night on Tuesday, not just for election night in November, but in the weeks and months ahead, can think through with us some of what we should all be focused on, what we should all be thinking about going forward, as far as the city budget, as far as immigration policy at the national level, how it affects things here, housing, which is always a concern, education, which is always a concern. So we have a whole bunch of specialists here, and I will introduce them. I will ask them a few questions. We'll talk for a while. We are going to invite you to join in the conversation as well, and we'll wrap up right on time at around 4:30. Let me start on the end. David Kallick is here from the Fiscal Policy Institute. Also with us is Steve Witt, Kings County Politics, who should have been at more of these community and ethnic media events, by the way.
Thank you.
Christian González-Rivera is here from the Center for an Urban Future, which is an incredible resource. If you haven't been using it, shame on you. But they generate a lot of really good, smart, thoughtful stuff, and I'm not just saying that because I used to work there. And last, certainly not least, Professor Christina Greer of Fordham University, who you see frequently on television doing battle with all kinds of people on MSNBC and on CNN and on New York One and on and on and on. But I'm glad that my friends decided to join us here. And again, I want to sort of think about this in a way that doesn't get too far off the core work at hand that we all have to do, which is talk to our communities, generate stories, analyze policy decisions, hold people accountable, and otherwise make sure that we're not losing the thread of what really matters for our audiences and our communities. So for example, why don't we start with immigration? We were talking about that right before we came in. We know that New York City, a city of immigrants, is going to be harmed by plans to freeze DACA, by threats to crack down on so-called sanctuary cities, by whatever comes out legally as far as a ban on Muslim immigration. What can officials in New York do? I always wonder and worry about grandstanding, that it's very easy to say, we should force Congress to do this or demand that the White House do that. Any protester can do that. What can the mayor do? What can the city council do? What kind of conversation should we be having in the city? And how do we in the media make that conversation happen?
You looking at me?
Looking at you, David.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, I would say not to be in favor of grandstanding. I do think that there's something important about the symbolism of a mayor standing up and saying we welcome immigrants, as in fact almost, I think, pretty much every mayor we've had has, including Mayor Giuliani in his time before he decided to be interested in national office, was pretty positive about immigrants. I think it's valuable at the larger level to have somebody just saying immigrants are a vibrant part of our city and we welcome them. And I do think at the micro level too. I mean, I saw in Philadelphia, as it turns out, the mayor involved in programs to help local level entrepreneurs in various ways. And one of the things that they had was people going around and basically giving little certificates of appreciation to businesses, and just seeing something with the mayor's seal on it was very important to people. So I think it's, I wouldn't completely discount that aspect to it, although the grandstanding can, well, let's not call that grandstanding, let's call that the symbolism and the bully pulpit. I think it's important at this moment, with the Trump administration doing all that it's been doing, to be really clear and thoughtful about what is exactly what you're saying. What is the power of a city, and what is the relationship to the federal government? And I do worry that that's gotten blurred often. That we want to say, Mayor de Blasio wants to say, we're going to protect immigrants who are here. Well, there are pretty clear limits to what you can do as a city, and I think there are some things you can really do that would help, but there are also some things that you can't really do, and it doesn't help anybody, I think, to pretend that you can, or to kind of voice that sentiment, including certainly, the idea that the mayor is going to have a lot to do with what they pass in Congress. So, I mean, I think on the big issue of DACA, and I don't love the term sanctuary cities, but like this question of what's the police in particular involvement with federal law enforcement, or lack there, what can the city do that can create some some separation between public officials who you can trust and who you can feel like you can go to, some police people you can, and those who you may feel like you need to be avoiding if you're undocumented, or might look undocumented to some people, or might think, I think that's a really important thing for the mayor to do.
I think is the publisher of Kings County Politics, it is from a journalistic point of view, first of all, I think you have to keep your eye on the ball. And the eye on the ball meaning that Trump did pass it off to Congress, so I think it's very important from a journalistic point of view to reach out to Senator Schumer, who's very good legislatively, and ask him, where are you? Can this be done in 6 months? Then, since there's 5 Brooklyn Congress people, I would definitely reach out to Donovan first, because he's in the Republican majority, and say, have you spoken to Speaker Ryan? Is there bills happening? I would reach out to Congress people, Nydia Velázquez and Yvette Clarke and Jerry Nadler and Hakeem Jeffries, and I would, as a journalist, I would try to pin them down. It's like, can this happen in 6 months? What are you doing? What bills are out there? Have you reached across the aisle? Is it possible to reach across the aisle? It's been going on since 2001. Is there possible legislation that can be done? I think as a journalist, I believe you always kind of have to keep your eye on the ball and move the issue forward, rather than get into the rhetoric on the city level. I do agree with my colleague here on the city level. I suppose, if, with the mayor, you want to make sure that the police are in line with your policies, to not get down on immigrants, to do as much as you can to protect the immigrants you have. But I also think even the mayor, I think it's incumbent on the city council to put it in Congress's court. That's where it is right now.
Okay, so I think that when writing about immigration and about immigrants in particular, I think one of the most important things that you can do, no matter what it is, what angle you're taking, is to make it very clear what we have to lose. So much of what we're proud of here in New York City, I mean, whether it's our entrepreneurship, our vibrant neighborhoods, the growth in our population, just about everything that we're proud of here in New York City has been made possible because of immigrants. Immigrants have a higher rate of entrepreneurship across the city. Many neighborhoods across the city that you wouldn't associate with economic development. I mean, it's like usually when you think about economic development in New York City, you think about big glass towers on the Williamsburg waterfront, or new investments in new corporate towers in Hudson Yards. But really, in neighborhoods from Flushing to Sunset Park, what you're really seeing is immigrants that have started businesses and revived commercial corridors that were once moribund, if you go back 20 or 30 years. This is the real power that immigrants have. Immigrants are 36% of the population, but 47% of all workers in the city. Basically, I mean, it's like immigrants are what has made New York great again, quite simply. So we should never lose that sight when we're writing about this. In terms of what we can do to protect immigrants here, it's true that the federal government has most of the cards. I mean, unfortunately. But that doesn't mean that the city's powerless. Starting with, I mean, what David said, I completely agree that it's very important to deliver that message that immigrants are welcome here. And there's a very important reason for that. I mean, it's not just symbolic. All these decisions, from DACA to the Washington's general stance around immigration, really have the danger of destabilizing immigrant communities. And by destabilizing, that means people are less likely to invest in their own businesses because they may not be here next year. People are less likely to do well in school because what's the point? You will never achieve the American dream. These seem like small things, but when you think about it at the level of the individual family, the kind of fear of knowing that you may not be here next year and also not knowing what your rights are, that's something that's hugely destabilizing to neighborhoods. So it's no small thing to say that our government needs to be very, very clear that immigrants are welcome here. On a more sort of concrete, sort of media level, we need to make sure that legal services agencies are working in every neighborhood in the city and in every ethnic community in the city. Because right now, we were just talking about ID NYC a little while ago. We finally reached, after so many years, this level of trust with immigrant communities where they can finally go into a government office, give their information, and get an ID. This is a level of trust that was no small feat to achieve. And now we're in danger of reversing all of that integration of immigrants into New York City just because of the current situation in Washington. So that really means two things. First, we have to make sure that people know what their rights are so that they're not in a position where they don't know what's going to happen next year. And second, we really need to look at what kind of data are we collecting about immigration status. And the current battle over the data collected by NYCID is a big one. But also, what kind of data is collected by schools, by other city agencies around immigration that could possibly be a target? And this is something that we really, as a researcher, I never like to say that we shouldn't be collecting data because goodness knows that I love data and this is, forms the basis of my work. But at the same time, we need to be very careful right now because immigrant communities are under siege.
And I'll just briefly synthesize some of the things that have already been said. But as the local media, I think that for you all, much of your job is to introduce certain topics to communities, right? Or explain topics that are already in people's communities, or in some ways present solutions for some of the issues that have been raised. And so in many ways, I see journalists as educators. There's a reason why when dictators come to power, they essentially imprison educators and journalists, full stop. So when you all are writing your columns, I think that you all should really think about how you can present certain ideas to varying levels of folks who have varying levels of understanding as to what the issue may be. There are many communities that all they're doing is thinking about their IDs, sanctuary cities, whether or not they have to live in the shadows. We've seen this happen in cities. Kids aren't going to school. Women aren't going to the police to report domestic violence. People aren't going to the hospital when they have a toothache or a stomachache, right? Certain communities know that. So you're providing them with information to solve that problem. Other communities may not even be thinking about that, right? So I wrote a book called Black Ethnics. It looks at Caribbeans and Africans and Black Americans. I'm on the board of BAJI, which is the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. A lot of people, when we think about immigration, oftentimes it's about Latin America, right? But the immigration, when I think about immigration, I think about Caribbean and Africa. So for some of you, you might be introducing this concept of, when we think about undocumented people or people who need the social safety net or need protection from the government or whatever, or from the government, by the government, whichever angle we're looking at, you can shift the lens ever so slightly and educate a new population of people so that they can think beyond just Latin America into other countries. Let's see, I think your job can also be to highlight organizations and resources. So they're going to be either legal services or nonprofits that are doing this work to work on the immigration issue. But there are a lot of people, especially in local media, who may not know that some of these organizations exist, right? So in your stories, I think that you can highlight some of the work without promoting it. You're not getting paid to sort of work for another organization, but you really can introduce some of the resources that can go to this community. And I agree with David, symbolism does matter. It has to move beyond policy. I believe de Blasio made that speech right after Trump was elected because a lot of people were thinking about moving into the shadows or moving out of New York, right? Not knowing where they should go and what they should do. And so if you're writing a piece, you can highlight the website that the mayor just put out about all the questions about DACA and all the resources that are there, and then add more. And then lastly, I'll just say, which I don't think this has been said, but actually talk to some immigrants when you're writing these stories. It's not just about federal and local policy, it's actually about the human stories that are connected to these issues that can really pull people in and help them understand just exactly who's affected. So I'll pause there.
Well, I mean, the point is really well taken, I think, about legal services. Because, I mean, a perennial story I know a lot of people write about are the vultures that try and take advantage of people's anxieties and, basically rip them off. Overcharge them, underdeliver.
Right.
Let critical deadlines go by, and then people are in a worse situation than if they had just stayed home and done nothing.
Can I just pick up on that a little bit more? I mean, I feel like I sort of started us off on the negative, like what the city shouldn't do, and I just I would say I think there's also something positive about the idea that the mayor really could articulate what should the relationship between the police and the local populations be? How do you make crime fighting and even terrorism fighting something about having positive relationships with your local communities? I think that's a model that's much needed. New York can be okay at that when it tries, can be really horrible at that when it doesn't. And I think, and I would say Mayor de Blasio maybe has been on both sides of that at various times. I think that's an important issue to me for this race. And I would say, I think the question, what Christian was alluding to with IDMYC, I think the idea that this was a part of the battle when IDMYC was first instituted some years ago. The New York Civil Liberties Union, which was very much in favor of having the ID, was very concerned about this question of what are you going to do with the data that you collect, and ultimately opposed at that time the idea of doing IDM reluctantly, I think, because they felt like it was a dangerous thing to have all of that data there. It was, I would say, one of the more shocking moments in politics to me to see Assemblywoman Malliotakis say that, sue the city for retaining that data. For what purpose could be imaginable at that moment, other than that we have the names and addresses and information about a number of undocumented people here? I mean, I think it's exactly to the point a number of you were making. I mean, it's both literally, immediately a fear to a lot of people and a threat, but also what does that do to the environment in the community? And what does that do in places? And I think there's a lot of overlap, as you're saying, I think, between the concerns of undocumented immigrants, of immigrants who are not undocumented, of African Americans, of people in the city who have lots of reasons to be concerned about what the police know about them and how they're going to use it.
Okay. Let's. I want to talk about something that I know is on everybody's mind and anybody who's covering any of the races this fall. Housing, affordable housing, right? Every candidate promises to support affordable housing. Very few apply actual numbers to specific policies and proposals. Just recently, I was moderating one of the debates up in Harlem, and I asked, I think there were about 9 candidates up there, and I asked what I consider a very specific, simple, and important question, which is, how are you defining affordable housing? There are a lot of different measures that are out there. There's the area median income, where the area is defined as the New York metro region. You get one number. You can define it as just the 5 boroughs. You get another number, slightly lower. You can define it as the community board where a particular project is, and you get yet another number. So I think of this as something that's really important, and I've actually even suggested to people, only half jokingly, that we stop using the term affordable housing. For one thing, I like workforce housing or something else that's a little bit more dynamic and a little more accurate, but affordable has been drained of a lot of its meaning, and yet it's arguably the #1 issue on the agenda for the elections. What's affordable? What's affordable? Yeah, looking at you.
What's affordable in New York?
I mean, everybody. We're not
No, I mean, so of course, what you're talking about is of course a big problem. How do you not only have enough? I mean, how do you not only have affordable housing, but make the subsidies go down deep enough that it is affordable to people who really need it? I mean, I think there's a technical question of the kind that you're talking about, but there's, I think, just, the commitment to, are you really, you're really interested in making a place for people who are just, getting started, who are on the lower end of the spectrum. And I think the city has been very weak at that, and it's gotten worse. I will say one thing that maybe you can see as a test of, it's not just about, are you going to put money into this, or, do you have a clever new idea? I think a lot of it is, how much are you willing to demand from developers? Because the story about affordable housing is very different in Detroit or in Buffalo, where you have softer housing markets, let's say. In a place where the housing market is so hot that you have a lot of developers who want to do a lot of development, if you put requirements on them, they will make it affordable as part of what they do. And I think the question is, are you willing to push that and ask them to really do it?
I think from a journalistic point of view, just from our local coverage, one of the more interesting issues that we cover when it comes to affordable housing is illegal conversions in Sunset Park and Bay Ridge, because the Asian and Chinese American community has no representation, and there's thousands in Sunset Park, and they need affordable housing, and a lot of Chinese are buying up the old housing. It was traditionally an Italian neighborhood, and they're doing illegal conversions, and at the same time everybody's saying, oh, it's very unsafe, and it is unsafe. But I don't think a lot of the Asian people that live in these converted housing really want to be there. But there's no affordable housing. And then when you talk to the people and you say, hey, we're having, our Asian population is exploding. There's thousands of Asians here, and they need affordable housing. And the people in the community, the city, nobody's really looking at that. I think when you're a reporter, I think there's two kinds of stories that you cover, and they're both very valid. There's what I call CYA stories, which is cover your ass. When there's going back to DACA, right? The cover your ass story is to cover what the mayor's saying, and you have to cover that, because if you don't, and everybody thinks that they don't have to do a CYA story, it never gets covered. So you need to do the CYA stories, but you also have to do the stories that are nuanced. You have to do the stories that nobody thinks about. I think in journalism, a lot of it's a herd mentality. All the reporters kind of like gravitate toward the thing. But as a reporter, you're always having to look for a different angle. And that's why I bring up illegal conversions, because people talk about AMI. What about the issue of new immigrants at NYCHA? Lori Cumbo, one of the council members, put up a whole big thing. Why are Chinese moving into NYCHA? That's traditionally our housing. But the truth is, NYCHA shouldn't be there for people as a lifestyle. It should be there. You need the housing. You live there. The kids grow up. They move out. They get educated. And the next group should move in. I mean, maybe that's true and maybe it's not. But I think as a reporter, that's a good issue to look at. I think if you have illegal conversions, it's an important issue, because if there's a fire, God forbid, a lot of innocent people could die. But the other question is, the other end of that equation is, where do these people live? The population's exploding over in that particular part of Brooklyn. So
what are they saying in the race over there? There's a big contested race in the 38th district.
Well, we're in Sunset. Well, actually, that issue is both the 38th and the 43rd, which is Kadir, our reporter here, is covering it. And there's a real issue in my mind about what you can maybe call racism against Asians, because they're moving into Dyker Heights and Bensonhurst. It's not only Sunset Park. Mm-hmm. This is a big issue, because the city and the mayor and all the progressives are like, illegal conversions are horrible, and they are. But it has to, something has to give them.
Well, what's happening when they try to move into Bensonhurst and Dyker Heights?
Well, they're moving in illegally. It's illegal conversions.
I got you.
They have nowhere else to go.
Uh-huh.
And Dyker Heights and Bensonhurst is what they call a bedroom community. So they like these low-rise housing, and the people there don't want to realize they might need a bigger development over there.
Who's the bad guy in that case? Is it is it unscrupulous landlords? Maybe there is no bad guy. Maybe this is supply and demand, people just in good faith trying to sort of meet an unexpected need.
Yeah, I don't think it's necessarily a bad guy.
Well,
just think
I mean,
it's a-
when somebody burns to death in their illegal basement because the fire department can't get to them, clearly there'll be a bad guy.
Oh, true,
But,
okay. Yeah.
but I just mean, is this a question of people unscrupulously and deliberately saying, I will pack in as many people as possible so I can get more rent? Or is it kind of, one-offs,
I think
small
it's
landlords?
that you're speaking of one half of the equation. You have to look at the other half. The one half is the one-offs, the guy that's trying to pack the people in and make the money. But the other side of the equation is, where is city government here providing housing opportunity when you have no Asian elected officials? There's no movement to elect Asian American officials. And these people don't have a voice. Where are they going to go, Errol? That's the other half of the equation.
Well, no, I mean, the question then becomes, right, what should the city do about it, right? So there has to be some minimal level of enforcement so that people are not putting their lives in danger, right? So
Right.
there's that. There is this question about who's representing, any particular group and whether or not they're getting heard properly. And that's one of the things, I guess, that's at stake.
And then where are you going to house them?
Let me ask anybody on the panel who's been following this. The Bedford Union Armory, which is in my neighborhood, because buried in this question that I raise about how do you define affordable is what happens when people think that the level of affordability is not being met. And in this case, people are defining anything that's not going to provide units that are affordable to the average income. This is Southern Crown Heights, Community Board 9. Average, the median household income in that district is something around $31,000. Actually, between $31,000 and I think $37,000. Not all of the units in this proposed Armory project would be affordable to people making that amount, and folk have gone ballistic over the notion that one unit should be built that anybody making $37,000 can't afford. I personally think that's a little bit short-sighted. It is what happens when you bring in private developers. They're going to try and make money. But the reason I raise it is that it implies a certain, buried in the fight, and it's a big, ugly, ugly fight. But buried in that are some assumptions about how gentrification works, about what it means to have units built that the average person in a neighborhood cannot afford. And I think it's a mistake to charge into a story without having examined those assumptions. You don't necessarily have to print them in every story, but you should kind of know what you think is going on, because folk will come to you and say, this is a story about gentrification. The Bedford Union Armory is a story about gentrification. And I would say, I'm not sure that that's what that is. There's a lot of other stuff going on there as well.
So I wanted to jump in on exactly that question, because, first of all, by stating the obvious, building and preserving affordable housing in New York City is really, really hard. And on the AMI question, it's like the first thing to look at is area median income is defined, you probably know this, by HUD, as for the entire New York City metropolitan area, which means that it includes Long Island, it includes parts of New Jersey, it includes parts of Connecticut, which means that the average household size in New York City is about 2.3 people. That means that the area median income for a household of that size is about $74,000 a year for the area. For New York City itself, it's $53,000 a year. There's a very big gap there. So if you're basing AMI on that larger number, and you're saying, well, this is affordable to 60% AMI, it's like that number is really including all the sort of middle income and wealthier people who live outside of New York City and don't have to pay the cost that, how much it costs to live inside of New York City. So this is a very open question. It's like, how should AMI be measured? But when you're thinking about that, it's like, just have it very clear that it's not the same pool of people that you're talking about. It's like you're talking about a certain population that's incurring high costs in Brooklyn, but you really, this is a question that involves people in New Jersey, Long Island, other places, et cetera. The other important thing to think about is that the mayor has made a big issue about housing, and he was right in doing that. It's like he created a very ambitious housing plan that included something that urban planners have been looking to, urban planners and housing advocates have been looking to get for a long time, and that is mandatory inclusionary housing. And in a context where you're having so much housing built, where the private sector is chomping at the bit to build more housing, that almost seems like the right horse to hitch your wagon to, so to speak. And in fact, I mean, it's like that is very good policy. But on the other hand, remember that the mayor also campaigned on the idea of a tale of two cities, and housing is only part of that. So when you're thinking about inequality in general, housing is a good place to look, for sure, because very often the way you feel inequality as an individual family is if you're getting kicked out of your home where you've lived for 30 years, and you see other people are being able to move in, other people get access to what you feel like is rightfully yours, that is very, very visceral, getting kicked out of your home. But remember that inequality is much broader than that. And in fact, some of the biggest issues around that have to do with access to economic opportunity. And that has everything to do with jobs. And Errol, I mean, you in your column last week really spoke to this. The idea is that not only should we be building and preserving affordable housing in New York City, that's very, very important, but at the same time, we need to make sure that people have access to the skill building opportunities that they need to make sure that they're competitive in the labor force, to make sure that the increasing prosperity that we're seeing here in New York City is something that's accessible to all those people living in gentrifying neighborhoods, that the people who come in who already have had access to those opportunities can also have, the people that already live there can also have access to that. And we can get into this further, I mean, it's like as we continue in the discussion, but the mayor actually, as soon as he came in, started along that path with their career, with the administration's career pathways plan, which laid out a plan to make sure that people have access to the skill building opportunities they need to be competitive in the labor force. So when you're thinking about inequality, remember, it's never just about housing. It's never just about displacement. All of those things are just a symptom of the greater inequality in the city. And a lot of that has to do with jobs in the beginning, because after all, the best way to afford housing is to have a good job. And if you can't access it, I mean, going back to your question about, NYCHA is supposed to be about, I mean, originally when public housing was conceived, it was about, you get a leg up for a while when you need it, and then you move on to other housing. But in a labor market where we're creating a lot of jobs in the bottom of the income bracket, and a lot of jobs on the upper income bracket that are inaccessible to people who don't have 4-year college degrees, those people who live in NYCHA are not going anywhere. So it's not possible for them to move out of NYCHA and bring other people in until they die. So that's not the kind of city we want to live in. So it's not just about housing, it's about inequality, and that involves jobs.
And I'll just say 2 quick things. I mean, as journalists, don't be afraid to be historical, right? I mean, a lot of what we're seeing right now has real deep historical roots, right? So if you are from, you're 3rd generation NYCHA, you're not like someone who's moving into a neighborhood whose grandma just died in Iowa and they just got a huge check and they're putting it down as a down payment. So I mean, that is a real historical conversation that has racial and class implications. And then also when you all are writing about these big themes, I mean, as Errol alluded to, gentrification is a huge thing. I mean, lots of people throw that word around, but it plays itself out in very different ways in different neighborhoods for different people. So I think also just making sure, I think going back to my original statement about you all as educators, really walking through your readers as to what you mean when you're using gentrification in a particular context for a certain neighborhood or for a certain scenario.
I think that, real quick, one, I kind of concur with Errol, or what I think Errol's nuances is with the Armory. The Armory kind of it started as something that seemed good, and then it kind of became a political football, where developers come in, they have to make money. You do want a recreation center. You do want some affordable housing. You don't want to, you want to keep Crown Heights, the working people, and the people that traditionally lived there for years and years. You don't want them to be moved out. On the other hand, you want something done. It's been empty for years, and it's just, it's a tough one. I'm always wondering whether it's just posturing or whether they could actually negotiate something there.
Yeah, well, it's our job, I think, is to try and create the conditions so that they can arrive at something rational. It's increasingly hard in that case because people are fighting bitterly over the hypothetical cost of an unbuilt unit, and it's kind of like, well, that's not displacement because there's nobody there. That's what I mean about some of the terminology. I think it's important to try and get it right or decide what you think about it. What's gentrification? What's displacement? If the average income is $37,000 and somebody builds a unit that would be affordable up to, say, $60,000, is that gentrification and is that displacement? There are people out there who are saying at the top of their lungs that it is. And I'm thinking, I can't write that. That doesn't sound right to me. But I'm not sure, that's why we have these great experts here. I'm not sure what's the alternative to describing that, I mean, and this is a citywide issue. I mean, same fight in Washington Heights, same fight in Sunnyside, same fight in every corner of the city, is that the mayor comes in with his program. The mayor says justifiably, I told you what I was going to do in 2013 and you voted for me to be mayor. Now we're going to go ahead and do it. The minute the actual project hits the street, there are people saying, well, wait a minute, this isn't affordable, or it's not affordable enough, or it's not affordable enough to enough people.
Or enough people of a particular demographic. And I think that's where sometimes the ringing of the alarm can come in. And as journalists, you all can look at some data, right? And don't be afraid of data. But, on its face, we might not say if you make $37,000 and the housing's for $60,000, that may not seem like gentrification to you. But if I look at the data and I say that, okay, well, that means no people of color or no people who have lived in this neighborhood for over, 10, 15 years can actually afford to stay, then I would scream at the top of my lungs, that's gentrification. So, and it's okay if you disagree with your colleagues, but I think, if you are going to use data, make sure that you're using data to support an argument where you have actually spoken to people and use it holistically. I really can't stand when journalists just throw numbers out there like craps, and it's and then they just walk away. And it's well, what do the numbers say to us? What are they trying to explain to us as well?
Yeah. Okay, we have some comments and questions here. I'll go through them quickly, and then we should get on to, I guess, transit or some other of the big issues we know are at stake here. Yeah.
I have a token, so I want to talk about transit.
Cufflinks made out of tokens. Okay, at the end of the day, are the folks who are hostile toward immigrants ultimately fighting a losing battle? Demographically, where is New York City and the nation as a whole going to be in 50 years? Point well taken.
Yes.
Yeah, well, I mean, my only somewhat cynical observation would be that for 10 years I've heard the Democratic Party talking about how 2040 is coming, 2050 is coming, and every time they do that, they seem to lose more seats, and ultimately the White House. So, I mean, we'll talk again in 2040, I guess. Do any of the panel members believe that the bigger problem the nation faces is not so much immigration policy issues, but rather the problem of white supremacy and lack of education in this country? There's a strong correlation between hostility toward immigrants and a lack of education.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think so. I think that's not, in a way, not really a question or not really a difference. I mean, I think that what we see today, in my opinion, and certainly a lot of my interest in immigration, it's not an anti-immigrant. It's anti-other. It's sort of finding. I mean, so you see the attack on Muslims, many of whom are not immigrants, or certainly irrespective of whether or not they're immigrants or whether or not they're even Muslims necessarily. I mean, I don't know, certainly African Americans and what happened in Charlottesville is just disgraceful, and I think feels very much of a piece with the anti-immigrant rhetoric, even though it was not largely about immigrants. And in fact is framed very much as something about sort of like white heritage, I guess, or some kind of idea of what that might mean. I don't know. My family is Jewish, and I feel like the history of World War II. I thought the big lesson of that was that if they I mean, the famous quote about they came out after the Catholics, and I wasn't Catholic. They came out. I think it's very much a struggle for what this country is, and whether it's a rule by a majority over a minority, or whether there's some kind of more inclusive way of thinking about it. And in some ways, maybe that's a little bit of your aside about the demographic question. I mean, I think one of the questions that seems to me very interesting politically is if you could look forward to 20, 30, 40 years from now, I think you've all seen the projections of how many black, white, Hispanic, Asian there will be. But I think the question is, how will we define what's white? How will we define what's the majority? And that we've seen that change over time in our history. And I think it could be that even though there are bigger numbers of people who are not what we now would consider white, it could still be that there's a newly defined majority group that could still see the other people, whoever those are defined as being other, as being a threat that needs to be suppressed.
I just want to quickly say, going to Errol's first question, demographics aren't destiny. And we've been saying, oh, we're going to be majority. I hate the phrase majority minority. It's like I'm a double majority globally. But we're going to be majority people of color, by a certain date. And that, I think, we'll always find new white people, right? This country is built on anti-black racism and white supremacy. That's it. Those are facts, not opinions. So I think we'll figure something out. But I think the education piece is really important. When you think about Charlottesville or the people who voted for Trump, you can tell yourself that they're poor and uneducated, but the demographics and the statistics point to a totally different number, right? The people who were in Charlottesville had PhDs, some of them were professors, many of them were teachers, they were educated people. So I think we try and throw it all into, the Hicks coming out of the mountains with, no teeth, and it's like, that's not the case, right? These people have jobs, real jobs, right? Some of them have pensions that they're complaining about. So I think that this kind of immigrant hostility, lack of education binary is usually set up, but I think if we look closely, it's false, right? If we look at the types of people who voted for Trump, he didn't get all just poor people. He got lots of middle class and, quite frankly, upper middle class people who were hiding behind economic anxiety, but pretty soon they're hiding behind sheets. So we have to really ask ourselves what that means if we're putting everything on the poor, uneducated folks, where they are a very, very small portion of people who are essentially propping up this agenda. Just think about the numbers of executives who are still, and elected officials, who are still ride or die with this president. And slowly but surely, after each egregious incident, one will come forward and say, okay, well, that's the final straw. And it's like, really? That was your final straw? It's September, right? So, I think we have to ask ourselves how we view, especially as New Yorkers, sometimes our elitist assumptions about, say, rural people or uneducated people.
I have to completely agree with this because, to start, our organization, the Center for an Urban Future, has been, writing about immigrants for a long time, writing about the benefits of immigrants in New York City. And in fact, it's like we started this whole discussion by, talking about that. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of the fact that this is not an economic question. Pulling the rug out from underneath all those, the people who qualify for DACA, that is not an economic question. I think it's pretty much well established that immigrants have built New York City, that immigrants are contributing to the economy all across the nation. So it's not about economics. It's really about racism. It's about people in Washington who don't want people with my last name or last names like mine. Basically, González-Rivera. So
okay,
it's like, you can't get more Latino than that, right? So people with my last name and people who look like me and like many of you that are out there, and some of us up here as well, basically contributing and also benefiting from the economic prosperity of this nation that we helped build. So we can't lose sight of that. So it's not just about putting out there, well, but immigrants are so beneficial. That's a big part of it. It's important for us to know what we have to lose. But at the same time, the forces that are trying to undo our work and erase us from the history of this country are much more nefarious than that. And it's not about whether the balance sheet is in the black or not. It's not about that.
I've got a question, and this is a very good one that I hope somebody could actually answer. It's a follow-up on the DACA discussion. Is there any way to protect those whose work authorization is expiring? In other
Already
words,
expired.
well, yeah. It's going to happen over time, and when it starts, it's going to gallop. It'll be thousands a day, as a matter of fact, of people who, because they're not taking new people into the program, and you won't be able to renew. That's, I guess, the current status of how they're trying to dismantle it. Does anyone know? What are the options for somebody whose work authorization expires?
I think
Uncharted
in
territory.
some ways, Well, in some ways we know it all too well. It would be, where they were before they had DACA, except that their address and phone number will now be registered with the government. So I don't think there's much, I think that the city can do the various things it can do to protect, to the extent that it can, undocumented people, and that'll be the same situation that DACA recipients will be in, except that they will also have their information registered.
Okay.
There's not a way. So Utah, for example, did try to say, could the state give work authorization? And I think the answer is the state or the city can't give work authorization.
There's a question here. What's the effect of the bill in Texas? And I think you're talking about SB 4. And SB 4 was a very harsh and punitive and very interesting law that was passed in Texas that says localities may not opt out of enforcing immigration law to the extent that the state wants to compel them to do so. And it's got harsh penalties. There are mayors in Texas who are saying, you'll have to put me in jail. And the law actually allows for them to be put in jail for not going and chasing down immigrants who are suspected of being undocumented. So that is a big showdown that is coming. We'll see how it all plays out.
Just to jump in on that, I think that puts also the local officials in a really, between a rock and a hard place, because on the one hand, the state is threatening, as you say. On the other hand, they can be sued in federal court for, Fourth Amendment violations, for not, you can't just go after people without some kind of responsible approach. So I think, and there have been, in relationship to ICE detainers, for example, I know there have been a number of lawsuits where there have been big settlements or, big judgments against localities for just abiding by what ICE was asking them to do because it was considered to be unconstitutional.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about transportation. The summer of hell is over, I guess officially with Labor Day. The infrastructure needs are not over. The money needed to create a comprehensive fix of the subways is kind of a moving target, but some of you, I'm sure, have figured out what that amount is. And what are the choices of where it can come from? There are lots of different proposals that are out there. So let's work our way through them, right? There's congestion pricing. Let's explain what that means, that sort of a thing. But let's start with how much money is needed to fix the subway system. Anybody have that number?
Yeah, well, as it happens, the Center for an Urban Future did a study where we did calculate that. So it's about $13 billion right now that New York City Transit is going to need for the subway system, and that includes the big upgrades of the signaling system, which would allow more trains to be run on the same track. And that, we actually calculated a bigger number, which is $47 billion, just to bring all of the infrastructure in the city, which is not just the roads and the bridges and the subways, but also our schools and our hospitals and all the civic infrastructure as well. All of that together, if you take all those capital costs, just to bring it up to good working condition, this is not building anything new, just to bring it up to good working condition is $47 billion. And of that number, that $13 billion for the subways is the single biggest chunk.
Wow. So. Okay. So that's a lot. It's a lot of scratch, right? So the proposals that are out there, we've heard the mayor says he wants to impose a millionaire's tax on the 32,000 New Yorkers who make, I think it was $500,000 if you're single and $1 million or more if you're in a family. That's one proposal, which has been declared dead on arrival when it gets to Albany, because the city can't do that on their own. It has to get something like that can be suggested by the city, but it has to be approved by the state legislature. Unclear what its fate would be. The other proposal is congestion pricing, and in particular, this Move New York proposal has gotten a lot of attention. It's not the only way to do congestion pricing, but can somebody explain the Move New York?
It's generally speaking, the Move New York is a measure where they will charge outer borough residents toll to cross the East River crossings. So if you live in Brooklyn and you want to get to Manhattan, you're going to have to pay a fee to do it. And then the other side of that is, as I know, one side of that is they're actually going to, in certain parts of Manhattan, you can't drive during certain times, or there's more money involved, like you can't be in Midtown during a certain time. But I think the main part of it is the toll to get into, to get over the bridges.
Toll into Manhattan.
Yeah, Manhattan,
toll
Brooklyn,
into the
Williamsburg.
urban core. And the Move New York proposal in particular was in exchange for that, or along with that, the tolls on the outer borough crossings would actually come down. So the Bronx Whitestone Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge in particular, the Throgs Neck Bridge, all of the ones that people bitterly complain about because it just depends on how your life is structured. I hear people bitterly complain, oh, I don't want to have to pay to come into Manhattan. Well, my dad lives in Westchester, and I take the Whitestone Bridge to go up and see him. So if I have to pay to go to the city, but I can pay less to go see my family, it's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. In any event, it's a proposal to try and get to the $13 billion that are needed. Where are we with it? I mean, what might or might not happen as a result of this election and the excellent reporting that's going to drive us to the next election?
Well, Andrew Cuomo actually supported congestion pricing. So, and it just like the millionaire's tax, I think it's going to have to be done at the state level. That's not a bad sign. I mean, if the governor says, hey, maybe we should do congestion pricing, and it's done in Albany, he wields a lot of power up there. So.
Well, I think you all want to just remember, one, I mean, it comes as no surprise, the mayor and the governor can't seem to agree on anything. And so that, let's just put it this way. Andrew Cuomo may have said he liked it at one point, but if de Blasio said he likes it, we can pretty much guarantee that Andrew Cuomo will say that he doesn't like it, right? Keep in mind, Andrew Cuomo is up for re-election next year, so he's going to say a lot of things. And he's going to look at his data to see what we think about what he says. And so, election Andrew is going to be a little different than sort of the Andrew that we've than Governor Andrew. I look at transportation, obviously thinking about sort of this city versus state relationship and who's going to pay for it and where would the money come from. That I'm still trying to figure out. Just because I work a lot on the Fair Fares campaign, where I think $2.75 is egregious. Especially for working class New Yorkers. And the mayor's tried to get around this, right? Because all of his new transportation efforts. So the ferry and the light rail and the bicycles. I mean, he's literally going through every single thing. Pretty soon it'll be skateboards. But if you notice, none of these things go through the MTA. That means none of these things go through Andrew Cuomo. So he's coming up with these new systems of transportation. But the thing is, for poor people, they can't use their Metro card. So yes, the ferry may only be $2.75, but you can't get a transfer. So it's actually not $2.75. It's $2.75 plus an additional $2.75 because you actually have to use your Metro card when you get on the subway after you get off the ferry. So I think that you all, when you're looking at these stories, to just scratch a little deeper, and thinking about the ways in which, going back to sort of housing and figuring out this index, what should sort of New Yorkers who can afford a monthly pass, I think $121 is a steal, right? What should the number be if we're thinking about increasing it? And I don't mind paying more. I don't want to give my money to the MTA because I think that they're wholly, just mismanaged. So if you all are thinking of these solutions and sort of educating your public to think about some of these organizations who are dealing specifically with transportation issues and presenting those as options, I would sort of start there.
Yeah, and let's keep in mind as well that, sort of the general federal rule of thumb for the affordability, for how much of your income you should be spending on housing and transportation is about 35% of your income. And when you look at a lot of the poorer people in the city, they're already spending 60% of their income just on housing. So when you start to think about it, it's like, hey, it's $2.75. Who can't afford $2.75? Well, but think about that. Again, I mean, it's like you're already spending more than 50% of your income on housing. Anything additional that you have to spend on, that you have no choice, very often that's, how to get to work on the subway, that's an additional burden. So just, that's an important thing to think about as well.
Without the luxury of paying for the monthly pass, so you're paying daily rates.
Exactly. I mean, if you can't pull up the cash, I mean, it's like, to buy that monthly Metro card, it's going to be expensive. I mean, it's like any little bit that you add on top of that.
Who paid for the Wi-Fi? I'm curious. in the subway.
You know the
That was
answer to every question about who paid for it.
No, I was
Staring you in the mirror.
No, but was it a city initiative or a state initiative? Does
I think the
anybody know?
MTA just got their act together and finally just did a shortcut to get it done.
In fact, I just had a little bit of a criticism to both the mayor and the governor separately about the proposals. I mean, I think, to me, congestion pricing, so you're describing the East River toll issue, but congestion pricing, I think the idea is actually about reducing traffic, right? And the idea is that the prices would be different at different times of day to try to even out the flow of traffic so you don't have such huge congestion. It implies the East River because you have to then have the whole island covered somehow, and we don't currently have East River tolls. But I think, so I think to use that as a way of gaining revenue, well, kinda, maybe. I mean, maybe that's gonna be inevitably part of it, but toll, I think, and I'm not against doing that, but I think it's fundamentally about traffic management. It's not, I mean, at least as long as you're talking about congestion pricing, it's not fundamentally about raising more revenues. I think the way to raise more revenues would be through taxes, and I would say, certainly the people, I mean, it's like Willie Horton supposedly was asked, why do you rob banks? He was a bank robber. Why do you rob banks? And he said, well, that's where the money is. I think that's the reason that you tax the higher income people in New York is we have this incredibly polarized economy, and that's where the money is. It's going to be, it has to be, if you're talking about an income tax, it has to be decided at the state level anyway. It seems to me like it ought to be a state income tax, which means that then not only would New York City high-income people pay it, but so would people in the rest of the state, and also people who work in New York City and live in New Jersey and Connecticut would pay it. And I think that would make a lot more sense.
Commuter tax, yeah.
Well, not a commuter tax, an income tax. It would be an income tax. So, I mean, it could be a commuter tax, sure.
Yeah, you're not going to get a regional income tax, though.
It's just an income tax. So
Yeah.
if you have an income tax at the top level, you're also talking almost entirely about New York metro area. It's almost nothing in Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse.
But at the same time, let's not forget, I mean, it's like this is an important part of this discussion that the state runs the MTA. I mean, everybody knows that, right? I mean, it's like so.
Well,
even-
Andrew said that he didn't have anything to do with it.
for the past 50 years, the state has run the MTA. I mean, it's a, there was a pitched battle 50 years ago, over that, between Robert Moses and, well, I mean, that's a whole story in itself. But at the end of the day, the state runs the MTA. They cannot abdicate the responsibility for this. I mean, yes, I mean, it's like, we can raise some of our own money locally to make sure that this work gets done, to grease the wheels, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, as journalists, one of the important things that you can do is make sure you're beating the drum to say, no, the state runs the MTA. It's your responsibility to make this investment.
The state runs the MTA, and I will say, I mean, I think you're right that you need something like $13 billion. I mean, there's a huge investment that's needed to make the MTA function, and without that functioning, the city is in real trouble. So as much as I agree with Christina, there are management issues. I mean, I don't know how you solve the problem without getting a lot more money into the MTA.
Well, I mean, because right now, whatever the city's going to put into it is equivalent of like bake sale money, right? And so we have to obviously, make sure the state puts it in. But I'm saying, if you're asking me as a citizen to pay more, I am willing to pay more, right? I have a job, and I think I should. I think 121 is a steal. I don't feel comfortable giving that money to the MTA because it's so poorly run and so poorly mismanaged by people who actually don't take the subway. So if there was a third-party entity, like this is what think tanks are here for, to sort of think about these solutions. I mean, keep in mind we have one of the oldest subway systems in the country, right? Boston's older than us, but we're after that. Everyone knows that, fixing the subway system is like, changing the tire of your bike during the Tour de France, right? I mean, this is a really complicated problem, but we can't keep throwing good money after bad. And the amount of money that the city puts in is really, I mean, it's a small amount compared to what we need. And so that was my point.
Yeah, there are a lot of solutions out there. And speaking of think tanks, Mitchell Moss, who's at the Rudin Center for Transportation, which is at NYU, his idea was either $1 or $2 surcharge on every Uber ride, which, he worked out the numbers. He said it would generate a ton of money, and you would put it in a lockbox and apply it to the subways. There are a lot of different things. It's also worth keeping in mind, as David pointed out, congestion pricing, the fees involved are a tool to sort of get the incentives in line with what we want. So for example, I buy a monthly Metro card. In fact, I bought it today. And I don't, you don't look at the price. I don't look at the price because it's not that relevant to me. If you charge me $121, I will pay it. If you charged me $131, I would pay it. I wouldn't stop paying it and stop going to work until it was some ridiculous number that I couldn't really deal with. And that, to me, suggests that it might be underpriced on some level.
I think the monthly is completely underpriced for the types of people who buy a monthly. I think you could push it up even to, honestly, to $200 that people would still pay for it, realistically.
You could for most people, but there's a whole question about equity there, right? I mean, the reason the income tax is appealing because you do it based on your income. I mean, sure, you and I could do that. We could pay, but I mean, there are a lot of people who already are having a hard time paying, can't even come up with $121 a month. If you raise them more than that, they're going to have a hard time getting by.
Yeah,
Right, but if we figured out a way where we could subsidize it for seniors and students, we can figure out a way to subsidize it for people who don't have certain incomes.
You could, although then you're basically running into a sort of quasi-income tax. I mean, you
Well,
might as
that's right.
do it directly.
Yeah. And we'd have to figure out what the
we pay a
cutoff
transit
is.
tax. We pay a transit tax in the form of aggravation because we have an underfunded system.
Right.
And so you sit there for 20 minutes, and
Right.
that has cost you some money,
Right.
right?
Well, let's not forget also that at the end of the day, I mean, it's like some people end up, because they buy a MetroCard each time, they may end up paying more than the monthly, So in a way, also increasing the cost of the monthly also puts it even further on.
Yeah, no, it's regressive. It's regressive for
Yeah.
people who can't afford a monthly. I also thought that you could create an entirely new category of monthly plus for people who want to do it. And if you throw in any some little incentive like give Shakespeare in the Park. Let me cut the line at Shakespeare in the Park or something like that. I'll give you $150 for my $120 card or something like that. Let me. I also did want to mention though that the question on congestion pricing. Tell me if I think you're following this closer than I am, but what I remember from the Bloomberg hearings that I covered was the whole crux of the problem, or one central big part of the problem was, as it is right now, and I see this every day, there's a caravan of trucks that come rumbling down Flatbush Avenue, over the Manhattan Bridge, and over to the Holland Tunnel because it's free. Whereas it's free all the way up. It's free coming from Staten Island into Brooklyn. It's free going from Brooklyn into Manhattan. It's free going into New Jersey. And they have to go up and down the East Coast. And so they go out of their way instead of staying on the damn highway and not rumbling through 3 of the boroughs. The idea of making it so that at least there's an incentive for them to find some other way to go. The fact that people would do something like that just to save whatever it is, $6.50 on the tolls, is a real cost that's being imposed on people, and it's very hard to explain this in a way that people get. I think Brooklynites sort of get it.
Yeah,
that,
if you live near the road, you're going to get
Yeah,
it.
yeah. If you have to cross Flatbush Avenue to take your kid to school every morning, yeah, it's like, what the hell we do? Like, why is there an 18-wheeler blocking?
I mean, I teach a class.
8 o'clock in the morning.
I teach a class in urban economics at Pratt, and congestion pricing is one of the textbook things that's in there. And it's not about raising money. It's about how do you best allocate if you've got bridges and tunnels and roads that are congested. But there are some places and some times where they're not being used as efficiently as they could be. How do you get things to be realigned? And so part of it is what you're saying, and how do you make it equal around the city? And it's in some ways, I think, unfortunate that the geography. We should think about moving the East River, maybe. I think it's unfortunate that it splits the city politically in that way. But I think that the idea would be, how do you make it? But that's not a serious proposal. Although Dan Doctoroff at one point proposed filling it in.
Yeah, well, that's about as likely as getting congestion
Anyway, but I
pricing
think,
through Albany.
but I think that the idea to me fundamentally about congestion pricing would be, how do you use that as a tool to make traffic more sane? And so part of it is what you're talking about, like, don't get truck drivers driving long routes that they would never drive otherwise, just so they don't have to pay the toll. And the other is, how do you get some of the people who could come in at 2 or 3 in the morning when it's not so crowded, and take them off the roads at 8 or 9 in the morning when it's really crowded? And that's the notion. You have to make the toll high enough that it really makes a difference in the peak times, but also low enough that it makes a difference in the other times. And you could do that. You could decide to do it without raising any money, right? You could make it complete, or you could decide to do it and raise some money. But that's sort of a separate question, I would say.
And you think it wouldn't work, but if you know your own behavior, like, how many people will circle the block 6 times instead of paying 50 cents at the meter? It's just like, you're just like, I don't want to do it, and you've got the 50 cents, but you just don't want to do it, right? So you give people even a mild financial incentive, they start to change their behavior. This is a question for any panel member. Christian Gonzalez spoke about the power of immigrants in economic revitalization. Do you think it would help if New York's congressional delegation actually sponsored congressional hearings where immigrant stories of how they helped bring about New York's economic revitalization got to be heard nationally? Would this, might this put pressure on Trump and the Republicans? That's a good question. That's kind of what you were getting at, right? Is that
I don't know, going back, and I didn't want it, the whole white supremacist thing, that I think that one of the biggest divides is between urban areas and the flyover states. I really believe that. I think that the election, they're called flyover states. There's California, there's New York, and then there's the flyover states. We don't really care. Let's just call them white supremacists. Some are educated, some not. And I think that's what turned the election. And I think that if you have Congress members say, well, New York's got revitalized because of immigration, it would sound good, but I think the flyover states would be, well, that's New York. I mean, New York's elitist. They're educated. The impression, if I was going to put myself in their shoes, just for a second, think how maybe they think, they kind of think, well, New York's a bubble. I mean, even Saturday Night Live had that thing about Brooklyn being in a bubble. So I think more important than holding a hearing is Congress needs, and they need to pass a law where the dreamers become legal, where all the people that are here undocumented become legal. There has to be a pathway. And I think that it's better put as a journalist to put pressure on Congress and the local that you're covering, whatever area you're covering, to really pin them down and say, how are you working to get this done? And in 6 months, I agree, if it becomes, and it could very well be that, then that's another fight that we have to take. Because as a journalist, we need to, at least I feel, we need to protect these undocumented that are going to be losing their job. But for now, the fight is in Congress to pass this.
Well, I mean, you're right. I mean, it's, the hard battles are the ones that need to be fought, and that's really important. But at the same time, it's like, I don't think that the benefits of immigration are just here in New York City.
Right.
In fact, one of the biggest stories of the past few years is that immigrants are no longer just going to gateway cities like New York and San Francisco and LA when they come to this country, but they're actually going to places like Alabama and Texas and places where you say, it's like, why'd you decide to go there?
Well, I agree, we should do it, but I thought the question was specifically how it's helping New York. But you're absolutely right. Yeah. I mean, places like Cleveland, Detroit, I hear is getting a lot of immigrants. But the question was specifically New York. And I thought if it's like to make Congress members in New York say, oh, look how great our immigrants here in New York. If I was an Alabama congressman or an Indiana or a Michigan congressman, I'd be like, oh, another New York, Yeah.
No, I mean, yeah, but I mean, it's beyond New York. I mean, it's something that should be national because, immigrants have been toiling away, basically creating the backbone of the economy across the nation and not receiving a lot of credit and also not speaking up enough. And so in places like New York and California, the elitist places as you call them, immigrants have been speaking up, but that needs to happen really across the nation. So that's not a bad idea.
There's a way to split the difference. I mean, we did an immigration special on New York 1, and the most fascinating part of it to me was up in Buffalo, where there were these African immigrants who had, enough had arrived that they'd, done what we do, right? You chain immigration, first the brother, then the cousin, and then you get a little market going, and there's a lot of entrepreneurial energy. And they're helping to revitalize the town. I mean, it's just amazing stuff.
I actually think that
Buffalo in particular looks more like Ohio than New York.
But I think as journalists, you all just need to make sure you remember. I mean, Pittsburgh, Detroit, Cincinnati, all these places are essentially like saying immigrants, please come. Like we're a sanctuary city, and we really want your your brain power, your manpower, all this other stuff. But I mean, I always get a little sensitive also with some of these stories because it's this like immigrant story. It's like, let's not also forget about migrants as in Native Black Americans, because sometimes if the story's not done well, then it sets it up with, you know, hardworking immigrants versus lazy natives. And there are a lot of natives who were stuck in these cities when there was white flight and middle class flight, who essentially kept a city afloat when everyone else abandoned it. And so now the cities are saying, immigrants, come, 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 we can make it a great city. And you've got black folks who are saying, well, I've been here, trying to hold the city together. So I think just, you know, be careful with the immigrant narrative of, you know, we're the ones who were doing it. It's like, well, there's people who are 400 years who were doing it too, just, you know.
Yeah, I would say, I mean,
Didn't come
I think there's,
with-
mostly
with
immigrants
the
are.
same forward excitement, enthusiasm, possibly.
Totally. I mean, immigrants, I think the most important thing about immigrants in economic revitalization is they're people, right? And a lot of the cities you're talking about, Detroit, I mean, I've been doing a bunch of studies and work there, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Dayton. Their biggest problem, like in New York's was in the 70s, was losing population. And who's coming to those cities? There are not a lot of immigrants. I think it would be an exaggeration to call them, you know, the central part. But it's the only place where there's growth is in the immigrant population. So it's not that immigrants are more, and you know, there's some differences. I think immigrants are a little bit more entrepreneurial. Immigrants, you know, may have some, you know, some different characteristics. But for the most part, I think that's not what the difference is. I think what's important is that you're seeing. You know, revitalization of neighborhoods. People are willing to take a risk on building stores and building on what's already there. So I think you can. I think it's also politically, what you're saying is it's economically true. What you're saying, it's also politically critical. That there's no way you're going to have a city like that, you know, be able to be really receptive to immigrants unless you're also having a way of thinking about how is it going to lift the lower income and African American and Hispanic communities that are already there.
In our last couple of minutes, I wanted to bring up a couple of things. One is Juan Gonzalez's new book has an important number in it that he has calculated. He went through and calculated the value of the major reforms by the de Blasio administration. Like, we know that there's a rent freeze, and so he says, well, what would the rent have been if it had gone up 2% or 2.5%, whatever it's been in recent years? And he puts that number aside, and then he adds to that number the increases on all of the stalled and frozen city contracts. That's another number that he puts in, and on and on and on he goes. And he came up with $21 billion, and it's not a perfect number. The scholars here, I'm sure, could probably sharpen it. It might be smaller, might be bigger, but it's an important, I think, sort of metric that the mayor has chosen not to use. But we can, in individual cases, you can sort of not lose sight of that, because I think that's going to explain a lot of what happens on Tuesday. You know, when people are going to say, well, why did the mayor win? It's like, well, I don't know any other politician who put $21 billion in New Yorkers' pockets in the last 3 years. Maybe that person should have run if they exist, right? So there's that to keep in mind. The other thing, though, I wanted to close on with the panel is we're at a moment where the very progressive mayor and the very progressive city council are essentially, if you step back a minute, there are a lot of little fights that are going on, different fights, but essentially they're all about to get voted back into office. I mean, that's one very likely forecast that you could make about Tuesday. What does that mean for New York City?
Well, I mean, we know that, you know, in Congress there's a 93% incumbency rate. I think that we need to look at the really abysmal numbers of turnout, right? I think nowadays, if you have your base, one is sort of candidate selection. We know that women and people of color are getting cut off at sort of these like party levels, right? And so they're not even getting into the pipeline. So you have sort of same olds, and they're not really jazzed about bringing lots of people into participating on September 12th, right? You know who's gonna turn out for you, and that's pretty much all you need. I think it's really unfortunate for our democracy because most people aren't paying attention to municipal elections, and this is where a lot of the money is and a lot of the action is as well. I think 2021, yes, will be a little bit more exciting because at the top of the ticket will be a contentious mayoral primary and possibly even a mayoral general if, you know, things sort of go de Blasio's way. But I think it says more about building a pipeline for people to actually get in on the primary system and getting rid of kind of this laissez-faire of, you know, the same old people are going to get in, we have our base, and that's who we cater to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that is a huge issue. I mean, it's like especially even among, naturalized immigrants as well. The voter turnout rates are actually very, very low, and that's definitely a huge issue. But at the same time, we can't forget the fact that our elected officials, I mean, very often they're called our leaders, but very often they're followers. They follow us. They follow public opinion. They follow the tenor of the public discourse. And all of us in this room are part of that.
That's right.
So we are the ones who can hold the elected officials accountable for what they say they're going to do and what they ought to be doing, and to make sure that we put what they're saying into a context that really shows whether it's a nuanced policy that they're putting forward or if it's not. And so really our work is more critical than ever. Even, I mean, it's like no matter how voter turnout turns out, even if everybody, if basically the slate does not change by the end of this year, we have to make sure that we're keeping those people accountable. That work does not change.
Absolutely.
The thing about Rikers, I guess, is the perfect example.
Right, exactly right.
Everyone said it could be done, and Rikers, it's like now where it's on the table.
Exactly.
No, I think when I read that thing by Juan González, and I'm very skeptical, I was like, yeah, it's a good point. It actually turned me towards it de Blasio, and I'm a very skeptical reporter, but I thought the rent freeze, more than anything else, probably saved a lot of people money. I used to be in rent control apartment, and so. But that being said, I think that we still have to be watchdogs over government. I agree there's a very low turnout. It's going to be like 8%. In Brooklyn, where we cover, there's 2 races that are open seats in Brownsville and in Bay Ridge. I think in Brownsville is probably a more, it doesn't get the publicity, but the mayor just came out and endorsed down. I guess the rule, they say, is to endorse up. But he endorsed down Alika Samuel, and he's also coming out with a Brownsville plan. And there's an issue there, like East New York, it is this mandatory inclusionary housing actually further gentrifying these neighborhoods and not keeping these communities of color intact. So there's a question when he endorsed Alika, the other people are saying, is this a rubber stamp? Does that mean he's going to put all the homeless shelters in Brownsville and Crown Heights, which he's been doing? So, there is some nuanced things and fights within the progressives that we have to look at. And I really look at Brownsville a lot, because Brownsville, a lot of journalists, they do like a Times, like a parachute journalism thing, or daily news. They'll drop in, do one story and leave. But I think that there should be more coverage in neighborhoods like that. And I think part of the reason there's corruption, William Boylan's in jail, Diane Gordon had a, Diane, right? Yeah. Had a problem. And here you got an open race. You have the mayor doing this Brownsville plan. You have East New York, mandatory inclusionary housing. And there's a real concern among the longtime black people that have lived there, that are mainly African American, that maybe the mayor endorsing one candidate could be like a rubber stamp. So stuff like that, I think, is a very nuanced thing to look at in these elections.
So, I mean, I think elections are a time when I think that both political parties right now are in real disarray and looking for some sort of vision. And I think a lot of that is also about what does municipal, or it affects around issues of municipal politics. Policing and education. I always laugh a little bit when presidential races turn on education. The president has very little to do with education. I think some fundamental questions about how our society is going to be around the country, and in New York City, of course, especially. And I feel like, it doesn't seem to me like we've done as much as could happen with this race to really push the candidates, and I guess I think especially the mayor, around those fundamental questions. What is your philosophy of policing, and how are you going to make that happen? What is your philosophy of education, and how are you going to make that happen? What are you really doing around affordable housing is probably one of the areas where there's been more coverage, and still it's kind of lost about what exactly has he done, the Juan González number, and also what did he promise that hasn't happened, and how do we think in a city like New York about gentrification?
I just want to add real quick, I'm sorry about this, but another endorsement I found was very funny, was the mayor endorsed Matthew Eugene in East Flatbush. Matthew Eugene, if you look at his record, that was, for the mayor to come out and endorse him, and people in East Flatbush are like, he's not really around that much. I mean, there's a real issue. Is he accountable to the voters? And I thought some of the mayor's endorsements in Brooklyn were questionable.
So I just prod you, I guess, a little bit to say, I think it may not look like a very competitive race, but I think there's no politician I've ever known to not be worried about the election. Nobody ever thinks they're just going to cruise to victory. And every politician I've ever known who is thinking about the next step after that. So, I think it's actually, elections are a good opportunity to get them to talk about some of those bigger questions and hopefully articulate a little bit more for all of us. Not just, are you the right person to be running the show, but what is your vision and how is that going to come into reality?
Okay, that brings us to the end of our time. Thank you guys so much for all of your insight. This was streamed and recorded. It'll be, I should say, this was recorded. It'll be posted so you can share it with other folks. I want to thank you all and wish everybody the best of luck with whatever it is you're planning to do for Tuesday. I've got some stuff. In fact, I'm going to run right now. I have to do one last debate, the Democratic primary in Staten Island, and that's going to happen on the show, my show tonight. And otherwise, we will see you in the papers and see you at the next event. Thanks a whole lot.